Hi folks of THEO 1004, Interpreting the New Testament, University of Nottingham, Department of Theology and Religious Studies. I'm your host, Dr. Sara Parks, and we're doing our module remotely. And so this is part 2 of our lecture on Luke Acts. In the first part, we talked about sort of the basics of the time frame of when Luke was written, the theories of who the author might be, some major themes, the writing style. But then I promised that in the second video we'd talk more about that writing style, and in particular we would talk about the formal preface. It's the only gospel. Luke is the only gospel that has a formal Greco-Roman prologue. So here's the slide that you're looking on with at your own pace on your slides. It's this one, the formal preface of Luke Acts. So it says Luke's the only gospel with a dedication in Luke 1:1, and Acts 1:1 has one too, because as we learned, Luke has a volume 2, and it's the book of Acts. It's Luke part 2. So it's dedicated to a person, I guess, named Theophilus, which is Greek for something like lover of God, friend of God, beloved of God, something like that. So what do we know about this person? I mean, that's it. That's all we know. So could this be a real person? Yes, could be. But some people have also suggested that the book is dedicated generically to friend of God, dear friend of God. And if the listener thinks, that's me, then they're more likely to give ear to what the book has to say. So maybe it's a generic title for anyone who's interested in being a friend of God, or for the non-Jewish churches that, as we talked about, the book is addressed to. Maybe it's somebody's real name. Maybe it is the patron of the gospel, the person who kind of commissioned and maybe funded the writing of the gospel, because writing is quite special in antiquity, as we've talked about. Very few people, maybe 10% of the people, could read in any way, and very few people were trained to write, and so usually you had to employ the services of a skilled scribe or a person who was able to be literate in some way in order to produce a text. So texts were a lot more special in antiquity, and so sometimes in order to produce a text you needed a funder, a patron, and so maybe Theophilus is the person who patronized the author of Luke Acts or commissioned it. So Luke has this preface with a dedication, and it's fairly typical for kind of a Greco-Roman historical writing, in that it emphasizes that the writer has done some research, it mentions sources, that it's knit together, and this particular preface kind of brags a little bit, that kind of suggests that there are other books in this genre, but Luke kind of says, but mine's the best. So let's have a look at your next slide, or if you have your Bibles with you, it's Luke chapter 1, verses 1 to 4. Let's have a look at this preface. So it's written in quite lovely Greek, not like we talked about how Mark, the Gospel of Mark, the Greek is really choppy, and it switches tense, present, past, present, past, present, past, and it really likes a lot of action. It's the best gospel, in my opinion, from which to make a graphic novel. But Luke, on the other hand, it sounds pretty fancy. Even in English translation, you can tell it's a lot more formal. Listen to this. Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. So just have a think about that for a minute. I mean, what can this tell us about the author? If we read between the lines, it's when he says things like, I too decided to write an orderly account, since many have undertaken to set down the events. If you read between the lines, he's kind of saying, many people have done this, but I'm going to do it in an orderly fashion. He's kind of saying like, those other guys, not that orderly. I, on the other hand, have used proper historians' methods of testing all my sources and investigating them very carefully. And I have, I've done my homework. I've been very exhaustive. And so, Theophilus, my friend, I am going to write a gospel so that you can know what really happened. So Luke has high aims for his writing in comparison with the other gospels. Let's zoom in and think about if Theophilus were a patron of the gospel, someone who commissioned it or funded it or partially funded it. Why would we think that? Well, we think that because patronage is a really important fact of life in the ancient Mediterranean world. Anytime you hear people talking about, early Roman Empire or Greco-Roman world in general, you'll probably eventually hear them say the words honor and shame. You'll hear people talk about the economy of honor and shame. And that basically means that everyone in the whole society at every level was involved in a system where you kind of could get credit with people. All of the relationships were based on a sense of honor or a sense of indebtedness, shame, kind of hierarchical. And so it was an economy of honor and obligation. What did you owe to people? Not just in terms of money and items, but what did you owe to them in terms of loyalty, respect, how do you get in their good graces, all of that kind of stuff. The importance of patronage in Greco-Roman society cannot be underestimated. It was important to the entire social, artistic, and financial structure of Roman society, every aspect of Roman society. It's we do have patronage today. Like we do have art galleries that get funded by, MasterCard, credit card. And then the gallery is able to do a really amazing show. But on the show, you have to see advertisement for MasterCard all the time. So MasterCard gets kind of some credit for being a supporter of the arts, a patron of the arts. And the artists get to actually get paid, things like that. So that's patronage today. But patronage in sort of an honor-shame economy is like our patronage, but on steroids. Artists, writers, and definitely business people sort of did their work mainly via a system of patronage. So for their part, patrons helped the arts and even created civic buildings, hosted events, all that kind of thing. So maybe Luke was written by its author for a new Christian, a new Jesus follower who was wealthy and wanted to have his own kind of, make his own stamp on the proliferation of this kind of newish Jesus following movement, Christianity. Some people have even theorized that this patron was a woman because there are a lot of women mentioned in Luke. But then other people have pointed out, yes, there are a lot of women mentioned, including wealthy women, sort of elite women in Luke and Acts. But on the other hand, they're quite silenced. They're kind of showed in subservient positions. So there's a whole mystery about whether or not the patron might have been a woman, if Theophilus was indeed a real person, and why or why not. As you know from being in my classes, I almost never come out with an answer of what I think. I just tell you all the theories that people have. A lot of New Testament scholarship will only ever be hypothetical. We have to reconstruct based on not quite enough evidence and using sometimes our imagination. And depending on which lenses we use with which to look at the evidence, we get slightly different takes. So, yes, Luke has an official sounding, formal, rhetorical beginning to his work. Quite fancy formal writing. He's definitely an educated person, and he has a dedication. He refers to sources like a good ancient historian, and tells you right up front. Lots of people have done this, but I am going to give to you an orderly account after having done my homework. Now, let's zoom in on what some of Luke's aims might have been. We always do this when we talk about any of the books we cover from the New Testament or antiquity. We always talk about guessing at what the author was hoping the audience would get out of it. And so Luke is no different. Some of Luke's aims were historically based, I guess. Like, Luke was definitely trying to produce a book in the manner of a history. Not every New Testament book particularly is written with that in mind, but Luke is acting like a professional historian in the way that he frames and writes. One of the aims of this book is to show that this new movement, this Jesus following movement, is truly upstanding. But in order to present it as an upstanding movement, he needs to show that it's really ancient. Because to a Roman listener, anything like a superstition or something new or like a new religious movement was suspect. And anything that was venerable and went all the way back to somebody like, say, Plato, anything that was ancient was, okay, this has been established, this has existed for a long time, great. And anything that was newfangled was considered dangerous. Romans would stamp anything like that out without so much as a second thought. And that's why there are so many crucifixions and just stamping out, no questions asked of any gatherings that reached a certain size or got too popular. So yes, Luke is definitely aiming his work at people who are Roman and think like Romans. And so he's over and over in the book of Luke trying to say this upstanding movement goes very far back in antiquity. It is not an upstart, rabble-rousing, superstitious new thing. It is a venerable old thing. So that's one of Luke's aims. It's to connect the Jesus movement way back in time, to show that the origins of the faith in Jesus are or ancient. Secondly, one of Luke's aims is, I guess, what we would call apologetic. So apologetic writing tries to argue for something. It tries to say that the position of this author is a valid one, and maybe tries to convince others to join the position. So it's definitely an apologetic work. And in one way, part of what it's saying to kind of not apologize for the Jesus movement, but to provide an apologia for the Jesus movement, one of the things it's saying is basically, nothing to see here, folks. These Jesus followers are upstanding, not countercultural, regular, respectable Romans who are following a very ancient tradition. So why do you think that Luke would be trying to say these Jesus followers are really very normal and upstanding and not weird at all? Well, the reason is because Luke is written after the war between Jews and Rome, which the Jewish people lost so badly that their temple was destroyed in the year 70. So everything kind of post 70 has this tinge of trauma over it. And so if you have a movement that looks pretty Jewish, but you're trying to pitch the movement to non-Jewish Romans, then you need to say, I'm not like those Jews that rebelled. I'm not rabble-rousy. I'm not anti-emperor. I'm not countercultural. I'm not doing weird things. I'm doing an ancient thing. It was those people who were doing a new crazy thing. My movement is just like any upstanding Roman movement. So that is part of Luke's aim. What are some other aims of Luke? So, as we mentioned in the last video, another aim of Luke is this thing that we call supersessionism. And it has to do with making non-Jews look really good and making some circles of Jews look really bad, and implying that God, the one God, in a monotheistic way of thinking, the divine, had shown favor specifically to Jewish people for a time. But that favor, according to Luke, is moving away from Jewish people onto non-Jewish people. And this is being proven in many different ways in the book of Luke. And I really encourage you to read the whole thing in one sitting to kind of see the rhetorical work he's doing and how he's working hard to blame Jewish people for Jesus' death, for example, and to lift up non-Jews as having divine favor. And of course that has had terrible repercussions down through history, which we have to be careful about. When we interpret ancient texts, we have to do it in their own context and not extrapolate to say, like, oh, great, Luke said bad things about Jews, so I guess that's a fine thing to do. Spoiler alert, it is not a fine thing to do. One of the ways Luke is doing this, shifting blame to Jewish people, mostly to exonerate his own movement and say, like, hey, don't crucify us, don't get us in trouble, we're really, really upstanding, we're nothing like those guys. One of the ways he does that is to say that Jesus was exactly like the prophets of old. So these new Jews who who rebelled and got in a war, they aren't doing it right. I actually understand correctly the ancient roots of this religion. And I, Luke, I'm going to show you how Jesus was just like ancient, venerable, well-respected prophets who in their day were respected by some, but ultimately often rejected by their own people and murdered. So Luke is saying, see how Jesus was murdered? That wasn't your fault, Romans. That was the Jewish temple elite. It was their fault. And the silly Jewish mobs that went along with it, it was their fault. They're just doing this ancient thing where they reject their own prophets. But Jesus, on the other hand, was misunderstood and was an upstanding prophetic voice and has come to bring salvation to everyone, not just Jews. And as we can see by all these righteous non-Jews all around us, proving that salvation is for y'all, not for those people who really tisk went astray. So that is one of the ways that Luke shifts favor upon non-Jews and makes what happened to Jesus seem like part of the plan all along so that God's salvation could be brought ultimately to Romans. Let's talk more about the genre, the literary genre or rhetorical genre of an apologia. An apologia. It was a standard form of speech and writing in the ancient world. It means a reasoned explanation of one's position or an argument that one's person or cause or position is exemplary. Luke's apologetic aim is to show civic-minded non-Jews that Christianity is legitimate, it is non-threatening, it is a non-Jewish religion, but it has strong continuity with ancient Jewish roots, not an upstart, crazy new cult, but long-standing tradition. It has validation from God. The evidence is that there are a lot of blessings going on. People are being blessed. And it has validation within its ancient Jewish context because its first worshipers worshipped in a temple, which was the proper way to worship. And the people in the movement are in favor with their neighbors. They make good neighbors. They follow all the rules of the Roman Empire and are very peaceful. This is Luke's apologetic claim and aim about the Jesus movement. Luke, remember we talked about the comparative method, how if you lay all the canonical gospels out side by side, the comparative method lets you see, okay, what's different in each one. Has someone added anything? If they've added something, included something that nobody else has, that can tell us something about their aims. So one of the things that Luke includes is that he's got Pontius Pilate, the Roman, the procurator. I don't know what the equivalent of that would be today. Let's say member of parliament. That's not true. Roman politician Pontius Pilate. This guy is known in other ancient sources to be particularly harsh, brutal, not Mr. Nice Guy. But Luke has Pontius Pilate declare not once, but 3 times that he finds no guilt in Jesus. So basically, Luke is making sure that his audience knows that he thinks that Rome is innocent when it comes to Jesus' execution. He's basically throwing Jewish people under the bus in order to exonerate Romans. So then if Luke is written as an apologia, who is his audience? Sounds like it's certainly not Jewish people. It sounds like his audience is non-Jews and Romans. Yeah. That's enough for now. That's enough to think about. So read over the whole Gospel of Luke, thinking about that prologue as you go all the way through, thinking about how it sets up itself as the orderly gospel, and think about the intended audience, and think about the temple has been destroyed, and think about Jews and Romans, two circles that overlap, but some are outside of the circle of wanting to be Roman and some are outside the circle of Judaism, and then there's this messy overlap. Think about all of that as you read and try and piece together what is making Luke tick. And then think about the unknowable question, which is, was there a patron behind Luke Acts? And if so, how much of Luke needs to please that patron, and how much of Luke is coming from Luke? Unanswerable, but fun to think about. We'll do one more video in the Luke Acts series. We'll talk a little bit more about what your textbook goes into on the comparative method. Differences between Matthew and Luke, we'll talk about those. Talk more about Jesus. Who is Jesus in Luke? And we'll do a little mini revision. So there'll be 3 altogether. Okay, bye for now.